So hopefully you'll be able to hear me in the back. If not, I'll use this, but I'd prefer not to. Let me switch over to the presentation part here. Okay, so well, thank you, first of all, to Claudia and the Jackson Center for Ethics for asking me to come here today and talk to you all. I hope that there will be a little bit of interaction. I haven't been to too many of these before, but if you have a question as I'm talking, raise your hand. I see a few of my students here, and I think you guys are used to that in my classes, but for those of you that haven't sat through one of my lectures before, I'd like to have some give and take here and some discussion, because this isn't just going to be a lecture. I'm expecting, you know, some interaction with y'all. So today I'd like to talk about primarily one issue, and that's, I'm going to focus today on overfishing. And I'll explain why I came to just that issue amongst all the ones I could have chosen in just a second. So fundamentally, I think that it's going to be important for us, or for me, to try and set the stage for you guys a little bit here and talk about, first of all, who owns the sea and what are the ethical issues that surround whether or not we do own the sea. So we're going to look at this kind of from a property perspective in just a second. And then, as I said, I'm really going to focus on overfishing. What is overfishing? And why is overfishing kind of an umbrella issue for lots of environmental problems, primarily in the oceans, but not just limited to the oceans. And can you guys hear me in the back? Alan, can you hear me okay? Okay. So focusing on overfishing, and then I want to introduce this idea, and I'd like for this idea of the shifting baseline to be something that you kind of think about as I'm talking and as you're seeing what I have up on the slides here. I want you to think about this idea that our perceptions, the way in which we experience the world, and so I'll use a simple analogy here. The fish that I caught as a kid when I went fishing, how that kind of sets the baseline for what I see and what I experience about the oceans as I grow up. And so I think the easy way to think about this is that my grandpa, when he fished, he experienced a very different ocean than I do now, and my son will see a very different place when he grows up. So that's what shifting baselines are, and I want you to think about how that kind of influences the things that I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, who owns the sea? I mean, I think this is probably something that most of us haven't thought about before, but nations are primarily in control of their seaward borders. And so over the last 50 years or so, a series of conventions, treaties, have basically been developed to outline the ways in which nations exploit the marine world. So you can think of this as being essentially these sort of borders that outline the coasts of the US here as being what we call our exclusive economic zone. This is a 200 nautical mile buffer zone, essentially, where essentially nations agree that we control within that 200 nautical mile border, we control the resources in that area. And so this is a relatively well accepted treaty globally. I don't know how many of you have ever been 200 nautical miles offshore of any piece of land. I've spent a fair amount of time at sea, and I've very rarely been this far offshore. 200 miles, nautical miles, is a really long way. And so I want us to think about, okay, how does ownership of the sea influence this issue of overfishing? So if we look at the world ocean, and again, US EEZ here primarily, and then a lot of this in the Western Pacific is actually United States exclusive economic zone. What you can see here is that there are some big open areas, especially in the North Pacific and in the South Pacific, but that to a large extent the oceans are owned in many cases. If you look at the Western, this is a region that we call the Western Indo-Pacific, or just the Indo-Pacific, you can see that essentially it's all owned by nations. If you look at the Arctic Ocean, up in this region, the Arctic Ocean is largely owned by nations, or at least controlled and regulated by nations. And so when you look at this map, I want you to get the sense that, okay, the oceans are huge, 71% or so of the Earth's surface, and yet we, us terrestrial beings, control a large extent of that area. Now if you look at it in a slightly different way, this is it's delayed data by about a week, but these are the positions of large ships at sea last week. So if we look at this, and these are all self-reported numbers, so it's cargo ships, some Coast Guard vessels, research vessels, cruise ships, oil tankers and things like that. The oceans suddenly don't look like that lonely of a place when you look at this type of map. There are people everywhere. A lot of these are large fishing vessels as well. And so I want you to get this sense that even though we live on land and that's really our sort of focus, the oceans, there are people everywhere in the oceans. So what is overfishing? I mean, you guys have probably seen a cartoon, something like this. I think it was on the poster advertising this talk, was a cartoon similar to this. And I put these definitions up here primarily so that we can all kind of have a common ground to work off of. This is, of course, supposed to be, I think, a discussion. And so if we define ahead of time that overfishing is really to upset the ecological balance of a marine or a water habitat by removing too many animals, I think that if we start from that perspective, then we can kind of broaden the discussion and broaden the ideas that we're going to talk about today. So fundamentally, I think we all probably have a definition of what it means to be overfished. But from a political, a regulatory, a legal, and economic perspective, people fight over what overfishing is. And so that's one of the things that I want us to think about going forward here. So I'm going to play a short little video here for you. Hopefully these will work. If this doesn't work, it's really going to be a long day. How's it sound?
So what'd you catch? The monologue today.
Hold on just a second.
You've got to be kidding. Do I even need the gauge?
There's two things playing here simultaneously, sorry.
I've seen fish this big in years.
Okay, it's not this bad. But fishing today simply isn't what it used to be. Almost 1/3 of U.S. fish stocks are overexploited, threatening the future of sport and family fishermen. Yet at the same time, our government is proposing to make unnecessary protections. This shouldn't happen. Please call your local member of Congress before we end up like this.
Okay, so apparently I had two things playing there simultaneously, so let me turn off the music. Yeah, the fish are still playing in the background. There we go. So that little video was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the idea here is that, again, think about this shifting baseline, right? They were happy to catch that stringer of fish. I mean, if you're a fisherman, you probably recognize that the stringer that they were using to hold those fish was a series of swivels. And that's really what we use to like attach lines and lures to things. So I put this video up there because I want to kind of bring this idea forward that overfishing isn't just gigantic industrial ships that employ thousands of people. It's not what you see on the Discovery Channel. That the individual actions of millions, maybe 1 billion people worldwide contribute to overfishing. And so if you look at, and I'm a scientist, so you'll have to forgive me a little bit here for graphs and numbers and stuff, but if we look at this graph, there's a couple of things that I want you to see here. One is that large industrialized nations, US, China, Japan, we fish a lot. We catch a lot of fish. This graph is essentially showing you world capture of fishes combined for the year 2004. This is data taken from the Food and Agricultural Organization, which monitors fisheries globally. But what I want you to get from this is that, okay, so the big countries, the big industrialized countries, we catch a lot of fish. But other countries that we would never consider industrialized, like Myanmar, for an example, catch just as much or just as much quantity of fishes as highly industrialized countries that have very rich fishing traditions like Canada. And so the idea here is that, okay, so we went from nations that control these different resources, and now I'm trying to show you guys that even small nations, even individuals, really contribute to this problem in general. So overfishing isn't a single issue. You can look at this, and I'm primarily gonna focus on 3 different ways of looking at overfishing. First of all, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be an exploited fishery. So in economic terms, in natural or ecological terms, what does it mean to exploit a fishery? And for a real quick definition, unsustainable capture rates. And so we're going to look at some examples of what these exploited fisheries are. And then I'll talk about 2 kind of related concepts. One is, and these are both more ecological in nature, what is size at age reduction? And again, this is very briefly the idea that fish really are getting smaller. My grandpa's experience and my experience are different of what a big fish is. And then finally, I'll kind of end things in that part of the discussion looking at fishing down the food web and explain what that is. Some of you are probably thinking, wow, bycatch is a really important issue associated with fisheries. And I don't mean to just let that one go, but in the interest of time, I mean, I could talk for hours about this. I don't think you guys want to sit there that long. So I put together a few different ideas of what I think are kind of the ethical issues that overfishing really bring to a fore. And so we'll look at several of these really quickly. Primarily, I'm going to talk about the consequences of overfishing, and then when we try and remedy or combat overfishing, what are the ethical issues that this brings forward? So one of the most obvious sort of ethical issues here is that over 1 billion people currently rely on marine fish for a major portion of their diet. So if you reduce catches of fish, if you reduce overfishing, people start to go hungry. And I think that this poses an ethical issue that is something we can discuss. Can also look at overfishing from a habitat perspective. And in many cases, this is what scientists are really studying. Those that, fisheries scientists that look at overfishing issues oftentimes are looking at habitats. And so the consequences of overfishing and of combating overfishing include habitat changes. And so what's being illustrated in this photograph here, this was taken in Florida Bay, which is the body of water that's between the Florida Keys and the mainland peninsula of Florida on the Gulf of Mexico. What's being shown here is this is a channel that leads out into the Gulf of Mexico. This dark area here is a seagrass bed. And these nice straight lines or stripes across that seagrass bed represent where boats, primarily fishing boats, have taken a shortcut on their trip offshore. Now what's ironic about this is that, so the guys are all headed out here to go fishing for things like grouper and snapper and other fishes. The baby fish that eventually they want to catch grow up right here. And when you run a boat across the seagrass bed, you destroy habitat that's necessary for the fish that you're going out there to catch. So there's an obvious ethical issue here and an obvious irony associated with this habitat degradation. We can also talk about this from a much more economic and maybe social, cultural point of view. The picture in the background here, to me, kind of has an old-timey feel, and it was taken last week in Washington, D.C. I think that this talk is particularly timely in that last week, February 24th and 25th, there was a literal march on Washington by fishermen protesting recent changes in fishery regulations that have affected members of our own community. And so I use this to illustrate the point that globally more than 38 million people are employed directly by fisheries. And those people employed by fisheries are profoundly affected, for example, when a fishery gets closed. What happens to their families and their communities when those jobs disappear because of either overfishing or regulation of overfishing. And then finally, and I put this one up here, I think that this is an ethical issue because partially where my background coming out of doing my PhD in Virginia on Chesapeake Bay, and also just kind of my own interests in things, that in my mind, fishing practices represent a cultural resource in some respects. And so when you try and address overfishing, you have to take into account that fishing practices in and of themselves are valuable as an activity. And so this is a photograph my wife and I took on our honeymoon in central Mexico, showing obviously someone involved in fishery practices. And historically, the men of this region of Mexico they worked cooperatively to corral fish using these big, large butterfly dip nets. They would dip net the fish out, and then they would share the catch within the cooperative. Nowadays, the only time this fishery is ever practiced is for the tourist boats, which are right there, that go across the lake to go out and visit the islands out in the middle of the lake. That's a cultural loss, in my opinion. So I've defined overfishing. Hopefully I've introduced several of the ethical issues associated with overfishing, and now I want to give you a little bit of the data. And as I work my way through this, hopefully you guys maybe will have some questions or want to provide some feedback. One of the things about overfishing that scares me the most is that if you look at globally, the number of boats, and you can count this in different ways, but the number of boats, or sort of at its most general level, the number of people engaged in fishing or that have the capacity to fish. Currently, we're at a level of capacity to fish that's 2.5 times what the oceans can support. So what's scary about this is that we're putting all this effort into catching the same amount of fish every year. Being illustrated here by this graph, again, this is FAO data. They're tasked with compiling fishery statistics for the world. We should be most interested, given the topic of today's lecture, on the red region of the chart. And what I want you to see here is that around 1985, 86, 87, essentially we reached a plateau in total capture of marine fishes. Now, in and of itself, you may think, well, great, that means that we're still catching what we were 25 years ago. But in reality, what's happened is we are fishing more people and more boats to catch the same amount of fish 25 years later. So this is a classic example of what happens when you start to overfish at a really broad level. You put more and more effort into catching the same amount of fish. I think many of you have had this type of experience before. You work harder and harder, and you don't get any closer to whatever your goal is. So this is one of the major concerns associated with overfishing. Now, we can look at this also, again, from a global perspective, but kind of start to break it down a little bit. And this slide is really designed to show you guys a few of the definitions associated with overfishing, because these will come up as we move through the stuff here. So if we look at globally, again, FAO data, if we look at globally, FAO breaks down the ocean into these sort of regional units. And those regional units are made up of fisheries that, or of activities that tend to target the same different species of fish or shellfish. Now, of the 450 to 500 or so major global fisheries that FAO tracks, they break down into categories that I'm going to explain here. So we'll say, for ease of sort of reference, 500 global important fisheries. Of those 500 fisheries, 1% are what the FAO categorizes as a recovering fishery. Now, what a recovering fishery is essentially a fishery that historically has been overfished, and now populations of that fish, shellfish, crab, whatever, are on the rebound or are increasing. So these are generally what we call success stories. 3% are categorized as being underexploited. An underexploited fishery is simply one in which more people could participate, or more fish could be captured without damaging the ultimate health of the fishery. And 20% are categorized as moderately exploited. These two categories together, about a quarter of all, remember 500 total fisheries, represent, I guess the easiest way to say it is, healthy fisheries that could stand more fish capture. So that's a quarter of them. So let's now forget about that quarter, and let's consider the other 75% of fisheries. Half of them, 52% or so, and again, this is 500 global fisheries, 52% of the fisheries are what we define as fully exploited. Now, what this means is essentially that no more fish can be taken out of that fishery without doing long-term ecological damage to the species and the habitats in which they interact with other species. 17% are considered overexploited, and as the name implies, these are fisheries in which removal rates are greater than the population can sustain, and so you see this slow decline in total populations. 7% are categorized as depleted, so we're talking about a quarter of all fisheries being in danger, and that's the key thing here. So a few examples of these in danger fisheries. If you've ever gone out for sushi, you've probably had bluefin tuna. Now, I put Atlantic bluefin tuna here, but for the scientists in the room and the marine science students in the room, this might be better to be said as Mediterranean bluefin tuna. Mediterranean bluefin tuna are critically depleted. Atlantic bluefin tuna are just depleted, so they're in a little slightly better shape. I use this as the first example, not because of the blood or the gore or even the fact that this fish is gigantic. I use this as the first example of overfishing because those fish hanging there range in cost, in terms of sale costs, anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a piece. Those fish are worth tens of thousands of dollars a piece. Each of these fish will sell in the range, these are smalls, will sell, well, that's not the name, and this is a Japanese fish market, but anyway, those fish will sell in the range of $5,000 to $10,000 a piece, and then they will be cut up into sushi and sashimi that could sell anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 wholesale types of, or value-added types of prices. These fish are worth a lot of money. And so when that fish is worth 20 or 40 grand, there's a lot of incentive to go out and catch it, regardless of how much or how depleted the populations really are. Now, if we look at a different story, where the individual fish doesn't have all that much value. If we look at cod, for those of you in the room that aren't college students, for my age and older people, you may remember a time in the US where you could get cod at every restaurant in the country. That it was like the de facto sort of king fish. You could get cod in Nebraska in the 70s and 80s. Cod is the poster child of overfishing for the 1980s. The cod fishery, primarily based in the northwestern Atlantic, northeastern states, and the maritime provinces of Canada, is a classic story of overfishing. Look at, we've got data back here a couple of hundred years. In fact, you could make the historical argument that the founding of, or that European colonization of North America was due to cod. Any historians, feel free to dispute that. But so what you can see here is that over about a 100-year period, there was a nice steady increase in cod catches. In the 1960s, early 1960s, something changed. It might have been demand, it might have been fishing practices, it might have been just the way in which we fish. There was a large spike in total catch, and then look what happened. You get this, what's called a collapse, a fishery collapse. Now, this type of sort of catch curve or collapse curve has occurred in lots of different fisheries. Now, what's interesting about cod and many other fisheries that have this real spike is that as catches decline to a relatively low level, a lot of people, for economic reasons, leave the fishery. They say, well, I can't catch enough to feed my family, or they get fired because there's not enough fish out there to catch. And you see a slow recovery in the population, and then as that population begins to rebound, the guys start to hear, hey, there's fish out there again, let's go get them. People return to the fishery, and you get a second collapse. In most cases, that second collapse is total. The fishery is never going to be the same after a secondary collapse like that. And so 20 years later, in 1992, basically we closed all fishing for cod in the US and in eastern Canada. And it hasn't recovered, and it probably won't. Here's one that for my students and younger people in the audience might be a better issue, or a better illustration of what overfishing is. Many of you, myself included, have probably seen the TV show Deadliest Catch, and you've probably seen images like this associated with that catch. What is this image? What do you think this image means in terms of the health of that fishery? Anybody? It looks good, right? Look at all these crabs. The ocean off of Alaska must be paved with crabs to support something like this. This is the hold of one ship, mind you, and one trip. So the Opilio fishery, snow crab fishery in Alaska, is one of the most highly regulated fisheries in the world. Quotas are set to the pound. There are big fines for going over those quotas. And this is a fishery that is on the road to collapse. It's a highly regulated fishery on the road to collapse. I think it's interesting. If you've ever seen the show, Deadliest Catch, you probably recognize the names here. Andy Hillstron's one of the captains that's highlighted on that show. His boat, the Time Bandit. I've watched this show a bunch. I think it's cool. But Andy Hillstron, I think, says two interesting things in this statement that are thought-provoking, I guess. One is this last statement here, that he doesn't feel that the fishermen are responsible for regulating their catches. He puts that idea back onto government, essentially, and says that it's government's job to protect the fish, and it's my job to catch them. And I think that brings out, in just sort of layman's terms, a couple of interesting ethical points that perhaps we could talk about at the end of the presentation. So remember, we've talked about bluefin tuna, we've talked about cod, we've talked about Opilio, the snow crab fishery. And now let's talk about one that's closer to home. The Western Atlantic grouper fishery is split about 50-50 in terms of commercial fishing versus recreational fishing. And the reason why I highlight this, not only is this a local issue, but it's also an issue that I've been working on over the last couple of years. And so this is all kind of coming together at the same time. So I want to bring to your attention that for the first time ever, Western Atlantic groupers, which is a group of species, they're all listed here. Many of these are probably not familiar to you, but this is an example of one of those groupers, the Nassau grouper. For the first time, fishing for all groupers is completely shut down from January 1st until April. This has been kind of a big issue in the news recently. Over the last couple months, here's a local news article looking at how the grouper closure has affected local restaurants and seafood markets. Another one from Miami, where in Florida, grouper fishing is a perhaps billion-dollar industry if you associate recreational fishing with it. And people are really concerned what this is going to do to winter fishing in Florida. So think about the ethical issues of this. And I want to show just a couple of minutes, those of you that kind of came in late, a couple of minutes of a video that I put together that'll be presented at a conference next week, at a benthic ecology conference. And this has direct relevance to the grouper fishery. This is a project that myself and several students have been working on over the last couple of years, looking at grouper populations. Going to be a really large grouper that's going to come out right down here. That fish right there is worth $200 at the dock. Wholesale price, not what you pay at the restaurant. Okay, so the video, you can watch, some of my students have seen this before, but you can watch the rest of this video on YouTube if you're interested. I think there's also a link to it on the Coastal website. It goes on for several more minutes, but we'll move on in the interest of time here. So I don't want to give you the impression that everything is horrible, that you can't eat fish anymore. Two examples of healthy fisheries here. If you like herring, if you're a Scandinavian person, the Danes eat a lot of herring, for example. The herring fishery is pretty good. These two graphs here are showing these upward trajectories indicate that there's more capacity within the fishery. So it's not all lost. Mohara, this is a small fish here, but mohara are one that has recently moved into aquaculture and is one of these fish that sustainably you can eat with some safety. So contrast these two fish that you see here with the bad ones or the negative examples that I talked about earlier. Think about the difference between these two fish and an Atlantic bluefin tuna, for example. So I want to kind of shift gears here a little bit and talk about a related phenomenon to overfishing. So we talked about the obvious part of overfishing, and that is taking too many fish out of the ocean. But overfishing has consequences at the ecological level, or even at the evolutionary level. When you take too many fish out of the sea, they get smaller. And so we're going to look at that, one example of that really quick here. Again, my grandpa was right. The fish he caught when he was my age were bigger than the ones that I catch now. So I didn't see any of the graduate students. Oh, hey, there you are. Hi. This is a paper that I brought up last year in the graduate seminar class, which is an opportunity for the graduate students and faculty to get together and talk and discuss science. And this is a paper that I brought to the group because I thought it was a really interesting paper. In this paper, essentially the author, Lauren McClenachan, got access to a photo archive. A photo archive in Key West from a charter fishing company that had been in operation, been owned by the same family for the last 60 years or so. And so the author got access to this photo archive, was able to go in and look at 50 years worth of catches from the same locations and primarily using the same fishing methods. And what was discovered was pretty profound. So I want to use this photo to illustrate 1957, and then we'll look at what it looks like in subsequent years. Let me point out a few things to you here. If you're a fisherman, you're probably falling out of your seat right now. These are grouper. This is specifically a species called Goliath grouper. This is the largest grouper that occurs in the western Atlantic Ocean. Fishing for Goliath grouper has been closed completely for 20 years. Last year there was an example of a person in North Carolina who speared one of these fish, and there are big fines associated. They're federal endangered species, the Goliath grouper. So each one of these really large, kind of dark colored fishes is a Goliath grouper. This is a day trip, by the way. Run out to the coral reef, drop some hooks down, catch some fish, and come back. Okay? So keep that picture in mind. A few years later, a decade later or so, one thing obvious is missing here. No Goliath grouper in this photograph. There is still large apex predator being illustrated here. Goliath grouper from the previous slide. These guys are apex predators on coral reefs in shallow water. Nothing messes with them, okay? They eat everything. No Goliath grouper in this photograph. There is this large saw shark and a few small tuna and amberjack in the background here. We move forward in time again into the 1980s. If you're a fisherman, you probably already see something different going on here. Even if you're not, you probably are noticing a difference here. There's still lots of fish. Lots and lots of individuals represented by this one fishing trip. There are still groupers. Here's a large, I think that's a black grouper, although it may be a gag grouper. There are several nice snappers, which are also a highly desirable group of species to target in this ecosystem. But what I want you to see here is a couple of things. There's still lots of individuals, right? But the mean size of those individuals has gone down pretty dramatically. And something else has changed. These fish down here, and to some degree these fish here, represent two groups of fishes. One that we call the porgies, and another that are called the grunts. Porgies and grunts are food for Goliath grouper. So these fish are now dominating an ecosystem that formerly was dominated by this really large Goliath grouper. You look in near real time, 2007, this is an average day. Same location, same boats, same family captains. There are 3 generations of captains here. Some of those same fish are still here. Here's a snapper, a yellowtail snapper. Here's the apex predator now, a 3-foot-long shark. I don't actually consider that a food fish personally, but nevertheless, they kept it. So look at what's happened here. Really 2 different things. The size of the fish has gotten smaller, and the assemblage, or the community of fishes that are caught, has also changed. You've gone from this, which is dominated by really large animals, to this, which is dominated by small ones. So this is an example of not only this size reduction that I mentioned earlier, but also an example of what's called decline in mean trophic level. A different way to say this is fishing down the food web. Essentially, and I think you can all relate to this idea, A fisherman, like any other sort of economic entity, is going to take the easiest, largest, greatest payout first. So you're going to go catch the biggest cod first. This is an example of the northwestern Atlantic Ocean food web focused on fishes. You're going to go out and catch those big cod first. Historical reconstructions of the fishery indicate that those large cod were all caught out by the 19th century. Those cod were already gone before many of our ancestors even immigrated to the U.S. So all the large cod disappear. Because fishermen are not out there just for fun, they're out there to make money and feed their families, they're not going to just go out and try and catch big cod if there are no big cod to catch. So they're going to start switching over to other species. Striped bass is an example, although it's supposed to be a striped bass, it's not, but it looks like one. They're going to switch to striped bass, or they're going to fish to other demersal fishes that live near the bottom. They're going to start fishing lower and lower and lower in the food web, until finally, in most cases, you get a system where either the only thing left out there to catch is worthless, or there's nothing left to catch at all. The Black Sea is an example of a really large marine, nearly marine ecosystem where there are no large fishes to catch. There are no fishes to catch. The apex predator in parts of the Black Sea are jellyfish. That's all that's left. So this is decline in mean trophic level. So again, I hope that I've kind of brought forward for you guys that overfishing is not a single issue. It's the obvious harvest mortality or catching too many fish idea, but it's also what happens when you fish. What happens when you pull a net across a bottom that looks like this? Well, it's like taking an earth mover into a forest. You go in, you knock down the trees, you burn everything up, and now you've got dirt. You can plant crops there, but not as many things live there anymore after you've done that. There are lots and lots of other issues here. Bycatch, which I mentioned at the beginning, but I'm not going to have time to talk about today, and other important ecosystem and habitat level changes that occur due to overfishing. So overfishing would seem to be this pretty obviously identifiable problem. I mean, you catch too many fish, that's overfishing, right? And I think that it would seem, at least on the surface, to be readily solvable. If you catch too many fish, catch less fish, and then you'll solve the overfishing problem. But in practice, this isn't easy, and this is where the ethical and moral and social and cultural and economic issues all really come into the fore. And so in my thinking about this, and it's not like, you know, I'm novelly coming up with all these grand ideas. I'm relying on the work of thousands of other people to put this together. It's really issues like this, which are the ethical and cultural and moral and social issues. I think that one of the main problems with overfishing, and one of the reasons why we can't seem to successfully combat it in a really easy way, is that there's a real disconnect between the way scientists talk, the way politicians talk and act, and the way the public perceives how scientists talk and politicians act. I think that the current drama over grouper fishery closures is a perfect example of exactly this right here. I think that there's also a feeling amongst many people that those resources, those ocean fish, be they whatever they are out there and they're there for us to use. Why shouldn't we use them? I think that part of the reason why this is a difficult issue is that there's probably a feeling that our choices don't seem to matter. I think like other large global issues like climate change, does it really matter if I drive a truck? I mean, if I stop driving my truck, is it going to change the climate? And finally, if I don't catch this fish, somebody else will. And so very briefly, I'll go through each of these, and then we'll look at maybe a way forward. So Daniel Pauly, he did that work actually on fishing down the food web that I showed earlier. He's a well-known fisheries scientist and somebody that writes and thinks a lot about overfishing. And I think he kind of crystallizes this idea that fishermen, and I'm a fisherman, and I'm also a scientist, fundamentally usually disagree with each other because they don't understand the difference between the two groups. I think that fishermen usually think that government scientists, fishery scientists, are full of it because when fishermen go out to fish, they go to places where fish are. They catch fish in those locations. Scientists, when we go out to look at fish populations, we go where we know the fish are and where we know the fish aren't. because we have to look at the totality of the ecosystem or the ocean or whatever it is. And so there's this disconnect between what a fisherman sees and what a scientist says. And I think this is one of the real problems or issues and why this isn't a simple and easy kind of fix. I think that we can also make an argument that those resources, those fish, those oysters, those crabs are out there for us to use, and they were meant for us to use. Certainly you can see this in some of the literature associated with the anti-science literature associated with regulation. You can see this type of attitude again last week in Washington, D.C. Individual choices. I mean, does it matter? Does it really make a difference? In some cases, I think that you can argue that, yeah, it does. And then in others, well, not so much. Many of you have probably heard of this. There are several programs like this where mostly conservation organizations have come together and said, look, these are good fish, good shellfish, whatever to eat because they have a low or a small ecological footprint in a sense. And some others are bad to eat because either they're overfished or their populations are slow growing or other things. And so they put out these are little wallet cards if you've not seen these before. And you're supposed to, when you go to the store or go to the restaurant, you're supposed to consult the card and make the most eco-friendly choice. Even some of the restaurants in Murrells Inlet will star certain choices on their menu to help the consumer kind of understand their choices. And I think this is a fine idea. Others have kind of taken this idea and really run with it and said, well, instead of worrying about all this stuff, what you really need to do if you're going to eat fish is you need to eat fish that have very low ecological impact. And the reason why they say this is that, in fact, if you look at global fisheries, about a third of all the fish caught, and we're talking about millions of tons of fish, about a third of that catch doesn't go to feed us. It goes to feed things like pigs and chickens, and most probably importantly, it goes to feed aquacultured fish. And so I'm working on a project now with a student looking at how can we transition aquacultured fish from a fish meal-based diet or eating ground up wild fish to a plant-based diet, therefore lowering the ecological footprint of, in this case, it's farm-raised cobia, which is somewhere on this list right there. Farm-raised cobia. So you can make an argument kind of in either direction here. Oh, and as a last point, I should point out that we don't like to eat most of these fish. So a few of these you've heard of, anchovies, right? Some occasionally, you know, like maybe your weird grandpa or uncle would get that on his pizza, but most of us don't eat anchovies. The only time I've ever eaten menhaden was on a dare. And sand lances, they're like this big. So again, you compare that to the choices available in this list, and these aren't very appetizing. So another way that we can look at overfishing and kind of why this is a thorny issue is that it's a tragedy of the commons issue. If you're not familiar with this idea, very briefly, the tragedy of the commons is this idea that resources that are held by groups often sort of devolve into a scramble to get the most out of that resource before it disappears. And many fisheries are exactly this. This is an example from our freshwater inland fisheries. This is trout stocking day. The truck backs up to the waterway here, and they dump 1,000 trout into the stream, and these guys are here to catch them. It's like this in South Carolina. In the upstate of South Carolina, when they stock trout, people, Alan, you can attest, right? People follow the truck around.
Yep, and they actually have websites online where they'll tell you where the truck's going to be at what time.
Yeah, so that you're there, you're the first one there to catch those fish as soon as they hit the water. So, tragedy of the commons issues, there is a way to deal with these types of property and economic issues. And so I'm going to kind of end the talk with a quick kind of overview of how can we solve these types of problems, these economic or commons problems. There's really two distinct elements to doing this. One is, first of all, and this is controversial, you have to restrict the access. maybe every fourth person here doesn't really need to be there, right? You have to restrict access to the fishery if you want to combat overfishing. And secondarily, you have to create incentives to protect the fishery. Okay, so if you make the fish into a cheap commodity, you get this. Everybody wants to get as much as they can, as quickly as they can before the guy beside them gets it. So you have to incentivize good stewardship for the fishery. So again, this isn't my idea. Somebody probably is going to win a Nobel Prize in economics for this if it ever really gets going. Again, economists, Yoav, you can disagree with me most fully and I will capitulate, but nevertheless, I think that they probably will. One way that lots of regulatory agencies, lots of government scientists, and lots of fisheries economists are looking at moving forward and really combating overfishing is to implement a regulatory system that turns fish into property, or turns the right to fish, I should say, into property, in the sense that we develop a system of what are called individual transferable quotas. And these quotas are essentially shares, like stock market shares, in the fishery. They entitle the bearer, or the holder, I should say, of that share to catch a certain amount of fish. And so the incentive here is that as the fishery grows, or as the population of fishes grow, your share becomes worth more money, more fish. There's also the fact that you can fish these, sell the fish, you can sell the quota, or you can not do anything with it. You can hold it and protect it. So ITQs, where they've been studied, appear to be a way that perhaps we can get at this issue. Am I out of time?
No, we have, by my watch, we have about 7 more minutes.
Okay.
And then I'll call time, and I'm assuming most of us are going to stay next.
I got probably 2 more slides here.
But I took 5 minutes of your time, so I give it back.
Now, as my students that are here can attest, I will go on forever. No, I'm almost done, really. Now, criticisms of this ITQ system are that, first of all, it takes what was previously a public resource. All of us have the right to go out and catch fish, and it makes it public. Oh, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. It takes what was a public resource and it makes it private. It restricts access to the fishery. So obviously there's going to be a lot of arguments about this. It also, and this is a consequence of that, it creates barriers to new people getting into the fishery. Again, the picture on the previous slide and this one from the fishermen's protest last week in Washington, D.C. MSA stands for Magnuson-Stevens Act, and it's a major fisheries regulatory act that essentially forced the National Marine Fisheries Service into closing down the grouper fishery. It also mandates the implementation of ITQs. So good and bad here. Another criticism of ITQs, and I promise I'm almost done, is that it incentivizes some negative behaviors from an ecological perspective. One is that it incentivizes what is called high grading. I experienced this personally. I've worked for commercial fishermen in the past as essentially a deckhand. And I saw this in fisheries that are highly regulated and have low catch rates. For example, in the striped bass fishery in Virginia, where you can catch and keep 2 fish. 2 fish. It doesn't matter what size they are, you can catch 2. Keep 2. What high grading is, and this incentivizes that activity, is that if you can only keep 2 fish, what you do in practice is you fish until you catch a striped bass and you put it in the cooler. And then you fish some more and you catch a striped bass and you put it in the cooler. You don't then quit and go home. You keep fishing. And if the 3rd fish is bigger than the first 2, you put the 3rd fish in the cooler and you release the other fish. Now, of course, the fish you release is dead at this point. But you have abided by the law. There are very few fisheries that regulate this type of behavior. There are a few, but they are very few. And then from the fisherman's perspective and from the commercial fisherman's perspective, there's a concern that ITQs will be bought up by the conservation organizations that have really deep pockets. We all know who they are, right? There's tons of money for conservation out there. So there's a concern that the Sierra Club or whoever is going to buy these shares up and essentially remove them from fishermen's hands. That's a concern, and I shouldn't make light of it. This is a real concern from the perspective of the commercial fishermen, and recreational too. And that finally, when you set up a share system in a fishery, you set up the potential for a monopoly to develop. So I'm going to end with another really short video, and this one's a little maudlin, but nevertheless, it's the transition to the end. So.
Thanks for the job.
Thanks for the interview.
Thanks for dinner.
Thanks for the medicine.
Thanks for the adventure.
Thanks for the water. The ocean takes care of us. Let's return the favor. Our most precious resource needs your help now. Go to thankyouocean.org to find out what you can do.
There we go. I'm done. That's it.
Can I start the questions?
Yeah, of course.
Aaron, I have been watching with great concern because obviously I'm not in your boat, but I've lived on the coast all my life. In your opinion, I saw your pros and cons about the ITQ, but is that the most ethical way to go? I'm so sympathetic with these people who fish for a living, that's all they've ever done. I'm not as sympathetic with recreational fishers, but I like to fish, but I understand that. But what about these people? Can we really regulate to the point that we rob them of their income?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're doing that now. I mean,
Right. So what do you think about it? I'm asking you, what is that, in your opinion, the ethical way to go and why?
it's such. I mean, it's not as simple as jobs over here, fish over here. I think at its root, this issue is it's the same issue that global climate change, population growth, development. Pick your large, seemingly intractable issue, and they all have the same causes. Those causes are too many people, not enough space, not enough resources, everything else. And so the fixes for overfishing are pretty much the same ones that you're going to have to put into place to fix things like global climate change and or population growth and things like that. If we just really want to talk about jobs, Chesapeake Bay is probably a model, not in a good sense, but a model of what happens when overfishing and habitat change impact fisheries. If you look back historically, back around the 1950s or so, a large percentage of the male population in coastal Virginia and Maryland was engaged in fishing in one way or another, and now no one is. Less than 1%. What do the boys of those men do now? Well, they're me, and they work, everywhere else. So I think that to some degree, as time passes, these jobs become less and less doable, and people are just going to have to change. I know that that's not a very sympathetic answer, but ultimately, if there's no fish to catch, what does it mean to be a fisherman? Alyssa?
Just another thing about the stopping the bottom fishing for grouper and snapper. Do you have any idea how long it would take if we didn't stop bottom fishing for those two species to be depleted, that section of it?
Well, one of the main criticisms of the closure from people in this region is the feeling that our local stocks of grouper and snapper are not depleted. That many local fishermen will say, this is a Florida problem. That it's those guys in Florida that have overfished their grouper and we're suffering for it. To some degree, they're right, but at the same time, it's not like these fish don't move around, and it's also not like more fish isn't good for the fishermen. So I think in the short term, hopefully this limited, it's a 4-month closure, this limited 4 months for grouper and 6 months for snapper will help these populations kind of stabilize. It will give the fishery scientists that work on this issue some time to go out and study things a little bit more. And that's really one of the problems, is that there's not enough time and not enough money to study these populations so that we can really assess them in a really meaningful way that will satisfy people.
I think part of the problem, like me and Wes took a fishery science class in Australia, and we learned a lot about what you were talking about. I think he brought up the fact, like our professor, about the communication between the scientists and the actual like fishermen that are going out doing it. Because do you think that's like a big?
I think that is one of the main. The question was, is the communication, the lack, I'll get you next time, the lack of communication between fishermen and scientists, how big a deal is that? And in my opinion, it's one of the main 3 or 4 problems is that, let me show you a couple, I have other slides here, right? Okay. My students know I never stop. This is not it, sorry. Let me show you a couple quotes. So I posted the grouper video that you guys saw an excerpt of on YouTube so my mom could see it, and and I told others, of course, I told students and things, and it kind of, the word got out and everything, and it got posted to some online forums for commercial fishermen, and these are the supporting comments that I received on the video. From people that are invested in this issue. And the reason I put this up here is this is a very prevalent attitude for fishermen to have. That, and again, I'm a fisherman, so those of you out there that are thinking, wow, he's really down on fishermen, I'm not. Many fishermen feel that for some reason scientists and regulators are out to get them. And I think that is a failure of communication at its most basic level. That the people that fish don't feel that scientists have their interests and that regulators don't have their interests in mind. When in fact, most of the people that are fisheries managers because they love to fish. They got into it because they love to go fishing.
And like you were saying before, the difference between like what fishermen see and what scientists see.
It's very different. Those are different realms. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point. Yeah, the question was, what about aquaculture, essentially? Inland farming of fish, isn't that the way forward? And it looked like for a while that aquaculture was really going to be the breakthrough that solved the overfishing problem. That looked like it was going to be the case. What has happened in reality, and a few of you have taken my diseases and parasites class. I saw at least 1 or 2 of you out there. What I'm going to put you 2 on the spot. What did we talk about in that class with regard to aquaculture?
They get diseases a lot, and then when they do, you have to kill them all, restart, try to pond them.
So, yeah, exactly. So the issue here is that aquaculture can do some. If you look, think back to that graph, aquaculture has grown, and it will continue to grow. But it can't replace wild fisheries, primarily for 2 reasons. One is that we run into the production versus survival problem, that the more fish you produce, the more die from disease, because they're not really meant to be in aquaculture. And then the other side of the coin is that for most of the fish that are the most value in aquaculture, their feed is wild fish. So we catch all this fish, we grind it up, we make dog food pellets out of this fish, and we feed it to our aquacultured fish, and we feel better because we aren't killing wild fish. We're killing aquaculture fish, when in reality, we're still doing damage. So aquaculture will fill some of the gap, for sure, and it will get better. But I don't think it can satisfy the demand that's out there for marine fish protein, if you will. Yeah.
Aaron, I used to work for the National Marine Fisheries Service in Honolulu.
You did?
Yes.
Oh, geez.
Okay.
So you should have given this talk.
Well, just take the economic part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we looked at extensively was ITQs. They're not only efficient, but they're also ethical in the sense that they recognize the fishermen historical rights. So, for example, if I had a family that's been fishing in the Gulf of Mexico for 100 years,
mm-hmm.
well, that would be recognized, and I would get a quota based on the average amount of take that I've had over the last 100 years. If I want to move away from that fishery, I can sell away that right.
Mm-hmm.
I might sell it to another fisherman, or I might sell it to a conservation organization. Now, what happened is, if you don't have those ITQs, and I'm a fisherman, and I want to leave, there's nothing for me to get if I leave. I'm just walking out.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's going to buy my boat at the scrap value, and there's nothing for me to benefit. So I'm going to keep fishing and fishing and fishing until the fishery just dries out. On the other hand, if I have an ITQ, as the fishery begins to collapse, the value of those ITQs will fall and will make it more profitable for conservation organizations to come in and start buying them, but also less desirable for other fishermen. So there's an automatic movement to conserve the fishery. And as a fisherman, my historical rights are essentially protected.
Mm-hmm.
And these type of arrangements have been used very successfully in New Zealand.
New Zealand and Australia is my understanding.
New Zealand started, Australia still has some problem with their scheme, but New Zealand's done extraordinarily well. And they not only recognize the right of fishermen, they recognize the right of the original Maori, the Polynesian people who were there, who also received some profit because they could no longer compete with the modern boats,
mm-hmm.
but they had some historical rights to the fisheries.
Yoav brings up a couple of really important points that I didn't cover in this, and especially in that the allocation of the ITQs is primarily based on historical effort in the fishery. So a person who had 3 generations of fishing effort and has caught 50,000 pounds a year for the last 10 years gets more shares to start with than does me walking in off the street saying, hey, tomorrow I'm going to be a tuna fisherman. I wouldn't get any shares. So thank you.
Or at least they should be.
Yeah.
Historical data.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to ask 2 questions about regulations, since I don't know a whole lot about it. The first one has to do with enforcement of these things.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it would be horrendously difficult to police 200 miles offshore and so on.
It is.
So the first question is, how severe is that challenge? And then the other one is, how real is the danger of secondary collapses? You have a regulation to ban fishing of a particular species or something like that. And then you lift the ban later,
mm-hmm.
then the fish collapses.
Yeah.
Seems like the regulation might not be the best plan, I guess. Can you comment on both of those?
Sure. Your first point was, remind me again, Dennis. Sorry.
About enforcement.
Yes, enforcement. So, yeah, enforcement is a major challenge for these fisheries, especially the high seas fisheries, like the bluefin tuna one, less so for cod, less so for the opilio fishery. And enforcement in those kind of way offshore fisheries is a national issue, and some countries cheat like you would not believe. I mean, essentially they have no enforcement of any regulations. Other countries like the US regulate it in primarily 2 ways, at least to my knowledge. One is they have observers on the boats. You can imagine that that's not a very friendly situation for a person to be in. They're an onboard fishing cop, and their job is to write down what the boat catches. NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, employs lots of marine science graduates to become observers on commercial fishing boats. So we observe and we record. All of the major fisheries have recording obligations such that they report their catches, and they're subject to random monitoring and things like that. So enforcement's tough, but it's not as tough at the commercial level as it is, I think, at the recreational level, where there's, on Saturday, 50 miles offshore at the productive grouper spots, the radio never stops talking, and you can see 5 boats in all directions. There's a lot of people out there, and those people do not get monitored very heavily at all. Those people, I mean, I'm one of them, don't get monitored. I haven't been checked for a North Carolina fishing license ever, fishing for grouper. So it depends. And then your second question was, remind me please again.
It was about secondary collapses.
Secondary collapses, yeah, and the regulatory climate that leads to those. So the secondary collapse issue, I think, is one in which it's driven primarily by a lack of regulation, in that when you see that big spike in catches, it's like a stock market bubble. That's the warning sign that things are getting out of control. And yet the incentive for the fishermen, the regulators, and everybody else is to not do anything about it, because look how much fish we're catching. There's so many out there. It's just going to continue to go up forever because my home increased in value 4% a year for 20 years until I moved to Conway and bought a home for the first time. So that's a difficult issue, and it's a regulatory one that requires very frequent and sort of ongoing monitoring of fish stocks. And that's hard, and it's expensive, and it's controversial to do. Other questions? Does that do it for you, Dennis? Yes. No.
Wouldn't there be a big controversy as far as the shares go of who got what amount of shares? I feel like that would be, I think that would be too controversial to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to this coin, and one of my concerns about it, and perhaps Yoav can comment on this, given his knowledge of the issue, is, so, okay, how do you do a fair allocation to commercial fishermen? That's one set of the issue. The second, in my mind, perhaps difficult part is, how do you allocate ITQs to recreational fishermen? Yoav, do you have, I don't know anything about it, honestly.
ITQs have been historically only allocated to commercial fishing.
Right, so how do you protect the rights of recreational fishermen in that climate?
Well, typically they're regulated, and there's specific regulation, for example, in the size of the catch, how many fish you can bring in. And for recreational fishing, there's rarely ITQs.
So it's regulated in the same way it's currently regulated?
General regulation, size, how many catch, season, depending on the species.
Okay,
and
so
not
it's,
so much with approach.
okay, it sounds like the short answer is the allocations of ITQs are primarily commercial,
Yes.
and then the recreational fishermen are probably represented by some total catch allowance or
A set of regulations.
yeah, size limits and
But
catches and
there's
stuff
still
like that.
specific regulations for different species.
Yeah, yeah, they would be, it would be similar to what you see now with the big card with all the sizes on them. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So at first this is going to seem like this relates to it, but I'm not sure if you will follow an adage where you have a scorpion comes across a fox, the scorpion wants to cross the river, you know what I'm talking about, right? So we talk about overfishing as a habit, but if you look back on human history in general, we have tended to deplete different animals, and that's evident by, extinctions like dodo and all that. So how do you combat people who just say it's human nature, it's just who I am, I can't help it? Is there,
I mean, that's a good point. It seems to be that regardless of how far back into history you look, that we have, as a species, have had an important influence on wildlife populations. There's an interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago about, the title was something like Sequential Collapse of North Pacific Megafauna or something like that. In English, what that means is that when European and I guess Russians would be considered Asian peoples, when Europeans and Russians first started really fishing in the Bering Sea, they started by harpooning whales, right? go out, you catch every whale you can catch. Well, they quickly killed all the whales in the Bering Sea. And so then they started hunting this thing called the Steller sea cow, which the Steller sea cow is this gigantic polar manatee. And they killed all the manatees. They actually drove that one extinct. And so then there were no more manatees to hunt. And so then they started hunting sea otters. And sea otters are a lot smaller than manatees, and manatees are a lot smaller than blue whales. And they started hunting sea otters, and they drove them to the brink of extinction. And so the idea here is that, yeah, if you look back historically, pretty much the history of our species in terms of interacting with other ones is to destroy them. So, just think, yeah, maybe I could quit right there, and that would be like the segue to.
I know that they're voting on whether they should restrict like fishing off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia like this week apparently, and that I guess Ford County and a bunch of other counties have gotten together and kind of like decided what they want so they can bring it up to the federal government and be like, hey, we don't want this. What is your like? Do you think it's actually going to regulate and pass that there's not going to be a restriction?
Yeah, so the question was essentially how many of the local governments are getting together to essentially apply pressure for their opinion of how the fishery regulations should be implemented.
Yeah.
This occurs on the international level to a degree that I really can't even imagine. One of my previous supervisors is the chair of the, I won't get the acronym right, but it's ICAT, essentially, which is the international organization that governs the international catches of tunas and billfishes. And so what happens at those meetings is essentially Spain and Italy and the US and Mexico and everybody else gets, all their delegates get into a big room together, and the scientists give a bunch of presentations and say, here's how much tuna is out there, here's what we think would be a safe, allowable catch for all you countries to catch, and you can divvy that up based on whatever. And then the scientists leave and the politicians decide, okay, we heard what they had to say, we're gonna catch 5 times that much fish. We're gonna decide that to protect jobs, to protect economies, to protect whatever, that really it's not as bad as the scientists said, and 5 times as much Atlantic bluefin tuna, it's probably okay, again, this year, and next year, and the year after. So at the local level, I think what often happens is that when it comes down to jobs versus fish, it's an easy choice, right? For someone who depends on votes. Fish don't vote, right?
So you're saying you don't think it's passed?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what issue actually Christine is bringing up.
Of the bottom fishing?
It's already closed. It's already January to April, it's closed.
Dr. Gilman was just saying like they were voting on it yesterday.
They're talking, okay, Dr. Gilman was bringing up the second closure of the red snapper fishery. Yeah, and that snapper are closed from now until June, and then they're currently debating whether or not to extend that closure for another 6 months. I'm not going to come down on either side of that one, actually. No. There's no upside for me in answering that question. Christina, no.
I just don't understand, like, how fishermen are thinking. Like, I know a lot of people, and even me, like, I think about it now and everything. But if you limit the amount of jobs you have now, you're going to still, like, keep the jobs in the future. And I also don't see how they don't see that they're putting more effort into their fishing, and the fish are smaller, just like showed in the picture. Like, they say there's always going to be fish out there, but they're obviously seeing that the fish are getting smaller. They have to put more effort into the fishing. I don't understand how they're not making the connection.
Because a paycheck is a really important thing if it's yours. And a vote to a politician is an important thing too. So, I mean, I think fundamentally this is a difficult issue because of those 4 things that I kind of outlined. That, for one thing, there is a very profound distrust of when a scientist says there are this many fish out there, a fisherman tends not to believe them for a lot of different reasons. And the politicians, the regulators, of course, are beholden to the voters more so than they are to the fishes, I think. And so things tend to go in that direction. for understandable reasons.
That was a good segue for me, and I know some of us have to leave, and so if there are no other questions, I just want to ask you a yes or no, because I don't want to talk about worship. But
Yeah.
do you think that aquariums, et cetera, are a viable way to save and preserve species? I've been in so many arguments about this in zoos. I'm just interested.
I had some of the stuff about the SeaWorld incident in the talk, and ultimately took it out in the interest of time. Yes or no question, I can't answer it because it's a complicated one. There is a role, there is a positive role that aquariums and zoos can play in protecting biodiversity, but it's not one that we should rely on because it's not safe. It's really not safe to say, you know, the last Carolina parakeet is in a zoo, and that means it's still around. Well, you look what happened to the Carolina parakeet.
I have been involved in this one. I'm afraid
I walk the other way when people ask me that questions. Normally I'm stuck up here, but yeah.
Anybody else have a very last burning question, because this room is given to someone else about 6 o'clock. So,
You briefly mentioned the magazine students that come out. Its purpose is to conserve fisheries. Would you say this has been an action that has been successful?
Well, it was recently reauthorized.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, the question was about the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is one of the tasks of that act was to protect fisheries. And the question was, has it been successful? And I'm not by any stretch an expert in that area at all. What I do know about the MSA and its relationship with fisheries is that it's been controversial, and that the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act has upset a lot of fishermen, because what was set in place with the reauthorization were these kind of mandated closures, ITQ implementations, and some other sort of either-or types of choices that either NIMS guarantees this population of fishes or it has to be closed. And of course, NIMS can't guarantee anything. All they can do is go out and measure things. And so fisheries get closed, and that upsets lots of people. And they, in many cases, blame the act, blame the law for that closure, when in fact, of course, it's our collective activity that resulted in the problem that led to the closure of the fishery in the first place.